what's going on with the global macroeconomy and so forth. When I started, obviously I come from an economic background. I've done it for years. Monetary policy, central bank policy, and geopolitics and other aspects of macroeconomic policy. And you jump into this supply chain, which is what the book is primarily about. And you say, okay, that's, yeah, clearly it's economic, but there's, logistics and operational research and other aspects. And I was researching all that, but I pretty quickly realized that supply chain is not part of the economy. Supply chain is the economy. And if you want to understand the economy, you're really talking about the supply chain at every aspect. Something as simple as a loaf of bread. You buy a loaf of bread at the grocery store. Like, okay, well, I guess it came from a baker, and I guess they took it from the bakery to the store by truck. So there's a supply chain. Well, that's about as simple a version of the supply chain as you can imagine. You have to just start going from there. It's like, well, did the bread come in a plastic wrapper or a paper wrapper? Well, that wrapper came from somebody. Where'd the truck come from? Well, obviously a truck manufacturer. Where'd the driver come from? Somebody had to make a career choice and be trained. And what about the diesel fuel in the truck? That came from a refinery, and that came from oil exploration. Then you get back to the baker, and it's like, oh, well, I guess he had an oven or she had an oven. Where did that come from? And then you find out that the ovens are, industrial ovens have parts from 25 different countries and so forth. Well, without belaboring that point, you get back to the farmer and the wheat and the fertilizer and everything else, and really what's called the extended supply chain. And you're like, wait a second, that's a huge number of countries, a huge number of imports, and a big part of the economy, which it is. And then every link in that supply chain I described has its own supply chain behind it to get to source materials and intermediate manufacturing and so forth. And then that's for a loaf of bread. Well, what about, your alarm clock, your car, your furniture, your clothes, and on and on and on. Again, I mean, you see the point that once you start thinking about what supply chains are, you realize it's just the cardiopulmonary system of the entire global economy. So the supply chain book shines a light on the entire global economic process. And I have whole chapters on that talk about China, Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and climate change. And you say, well, they're interesting topics, but what do China, Russia, and climate change have to do with the supply chain? Well, the answer is they are, kind of global macro earthquakes. Clearly, the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine led to sanctions against Russia that affect everything, imports, exports, strategic materials, semiconductors, fertilizer, oil, natural gas, et cetera. And then you're saying, well, okay, Boeing makes aircraft. They need titanium and aluminum. Where does that come from? Turns out about 30% of it comes from Russia. So how are you going to keep the Boeing assembly line going when you're shutting down strategic metals from Russia? And again, not to belabor, but you can go kind of on and on there. China, everyone says, well, they've slowed down because of the zero COVID policy. And that certainly has been detrimental to their economy. Zero COVID, the way it works in China is if there's one case, one person gets COVID, they quarantine that person. You're locked in your apartment for, 2 weeks or so. 3 or 4 cases in a neighborhood, they'll lock down a whole building or a whole neighborhood. 20 or 50 cases, they'll lock down a whole city. And they have. Shanghai, a city of 26 million people, Beijing, a city of 22 million people, they were both locked down entirely earlier this year, last spring. When I say entirely, no transportation in or out, nobody on the streets. You had some essential workers, people had to get to work. They had, you had to have a COVID test, a negative result that was not more than 2 days old, which meant you had to be tested like 4 times a week. They set up tents on every other street corner, every third street corner with these COVID testing centers, and you could get your results online, carried around on your iPhone or Samsung or whatever. So these were extreme lockdowns and obviously very, very detrimental to the economy. It got so bad that around the end of November, there was tragically a fire. No one knows how many people were killed. This is in an apartment building. No one knows how many people were killed because the government of China suppressed the information, but estimates kind of low end, maybe 50, but it could have been a lot more, sadly. But one of the reasons they burned to death in the fire was the fire engines couldn't get to the building to put out the fire because of all these COVID roadblocks. So this was an avoidable tragedy made far worse because of the COVID lockdown. So this led to riots and demonstrations all across China. It started in one city, but spread very widely. And it started to get the look and feel of almost like a Tiananmen Square protest. And that was June 1989, when there was a massacre following that. Really shut down U.S.-China economic relations for about 4 years. I was traveling in China at the time, 91, 92. I never saw an American. There were Brits and Germans and Aussies around, and I was in central China, Wuhan and Chongqing and Xi'an and elsewhere. So it wasn't like I was sitting in downtown Beijing, but you couldn't find an American. So it's kind of that extreme. Now those have died down a little bit, and China's saying, well, now we're going to relax our zero COVID policy a little bit. That's just a sop. It's just throwing a bone to avoid more social unrest. But then you see, in U.S. stock markets, there's a Chinese large cap ETF that's been rallying a little bit. Wall Street says, well, if China's ending zero COVID, the economy is going to improve, so buy Chinese stocks. Typical Wall Street analysis about, paper thin in terms of depth. But it misses a lot of things. Number one, these are central orders coming from the Chinese Communist Party. They push them down to the localities and they say, ease up a little bit. But let's say you're a mayor or a local party official or just a city, block captain or whatever, Communist Party cadre, and you take it easy a little bit because Beijing said so, but then there's a huge outbreak, which there may very well be. So all of a sudden you can't win if you follow orders. But things get out of control, they'll blame you. They say, well, you were too easy. No, is this always your fault? So, and that can lead to consequences. At best, your career is derailed and maybe you end up in jail or end up dead. So it's one thing to say it, and the Wall Street takes a superficial take and buys Chinese stocks. It's another thing to understand the reality. The thing with the virus is none of what I just described, the zero COVID policy and the relaxation and possible consequences, et cetera, none of that has anything to do with medicine or public health. It's not science. That's just ideology. As far as public health is concerned, the virus, it's a respiratory virus. It goes in the air. Lockdowns don't stop it. There's good evidence that the best thing you can do for COVID is get outside with no mask and get some exercise and fresh air and sunshine. And plus basic stuff like washing your hands, that stuff works better. When you lock people down, you create incubators and the virus spreads even faster. So this is not going to work. And so then you say, well, what is the solution? Well, the solution for China is the same one it was in the United States and Europe, which is called herd immunity. You kind of, you can have all the treatment centers and hospital beds you like, but at the end of the day, you kind of have to just let the virus rip. The fatality rate is quite low. It's, a fraction of 1%, like 1/4 of 1%. So 99.75% survival rate, which is, better than the flu. But in large populations, you'll sadly have some deaths. Now, if you let the virus rip in China, the numbers, the math is pretty simple. It's 1.4 billion people. If you assume a 30% infection rate, which is probably reasonable, you get to something like 420 million people get COVID. And then with a 1/4, 1% fatality rate, you get to about 1 million dead. Well, that's sad, but that's to be expected. That's how these things work. But eventually you would get past it. But what does it do when you have 1 million dead and millions more in hospitals and they don't even have enough hospital beds? That's a separate source of social unrest. So China's in a no-win situation. If they continue zero COVID, they're in the process of destroying the economy, and you get social unrest because people don't like to be locked up. But if you relax that and let the virus rip, you'll get past it eventually, but you'll have 1 million dead in the meantime and an overwhelmed medical system. And their vaccines don't work, and actually our vaccines don't work, but their vaccines don't work even as well as ours, and none of them work. None of them stop the spread. None of them stop infection. So they're not really vaccines. So You can kind of say, well, we're going to make different choices in China, but my point is none of them are good. You're either destroying the economy and creating social unrest, or letting the virus rip and creating social unrest for different reasons. So, and China has problems anyway. If there was no COVID in China, they would be collapsing anyway because of real estate, demographics, corruption, pollution, and higher oil and gas prices, inflation, and they're draining U.S. dollar reserves. So they're an economic basket case with or without COVID, but COVID makes it worse. Europe is already in recession. It's going to get a lot worse. I hate to use cliches, but I guess it was Game of Thrones. They said, winter is coming. Well, winter's here. It's getting very cold very fast in Europe. They don't have enough energy. The U.S. and U.K. together blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. That's not going to be a source of natural gas. And now they put this cap. I say they, meaning NATO, the U.S. and EU, put a cap on Russian oil prices. Well, the one thing we know about price controls is they never work. They just never work. You can guarantee the price will be higher because you'll create shortages and move things to the black market.